Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Anna Krawczyk-Łaskarewska. I'll be moderating this penultimate session, session 12. I don't know about you, but I feel like we could have more, like 3 more, 4 more. Nah, that was But really, I feel that this will be an exciting panel, and in fact, privately, I call it American Studies in Poland at its best, right? So that's how I would actually title this, this session. And we have 4 speakers in that session, and the first speaker will be Dr. Ewa Antoszek. And let me read a few words about her. She is assistant professor at the Department of American Literature and Culture of Maria Curie-Sklodowska University in Lublin. Her interests include American ethnic literatures with a particular focus on Mexican-American and African-American writers, women's studies, and representations of spaces in literature. Her PhD analyzed multiple ways of identity construction in Chicana literature. She's the author of Out of the Margins, Identity Formation in Contemporary Chicana Writings, published in 2012, and several articles analyzing issues related to the situation of ethnic minorities in the US. She's also the co-editor of Inne Bębny, Różnica i niezgoda w literaturze i kulturze amerykańskiej, Different Drums, Difference and Dissent in American Literature and Culture. The title of her presentation will be Crossing the Borders of Tradition, the Play of Pretext in Alma López, Representations of the Virgin of Guadalupe. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for a very nice introduction, and thank you for coming here on the last day, because I know that speaking on the very last day, on the very last session, can have a lot of disadvantages. People are usually tired, so you need to be entertaining. And another thing is, so many smart things have already been said, but it's really, really hard to live up, to all these expectations and standards that have been set. But on the other hand, it also has a lot of advantages. I can refer to what somebody has already said, and later on, blame them for the definition they provided. I can also take up on some things that have been already said. So I'm going to start with 2 things that have already been said. I'm going to start with saying thank you. Thank the organizers for this wonderful conference and Terra Foundation for allowing us to be here. And the second thing I want to take up on is what Robert yesterday said. His disclaimer that in my presentation I'm not going to make any aesthetic judgments, but I'm going to make cultural interpretations, quote unquote. So thank you, Robert, for that. So I'm going to talk about Alma López, and Alma López is a visual artist who in her works illustrates emergent new visions and versions of identity and culture. Those new narratives and constructions of self and community, as Ibarra Frost observes, quote, as opposed to traditional stories stressing coherence, totality, and closure, opt for processes of cross-referencing between locations and multiple inflections of identity, end of quote, thus creating an alternative culture. The artist was born in Mexico, but raised in Los Angeles, where she witnessed the Chicano arts renaissance of the 1960s and 70s, especially mural art renaissance. She began her artistic career in 1990s, and her areas of expertise include painting, photography, printmaking, though she is mostly recognized by her nickname, the Digital Diva, that reveals her involvement with computer technologies as the medium of her artistic creation. No matter which technology she deploys in her works, she places women at the center of discourses on emancipation and colonization. And her artistic creation expound what gender scholars would call a Chicana queer aesthetic. Hence, as Latour maintains, quote, López's work centers around a feminist and queer rethinking of traditional Mexican icons, many of which are imbued with a deeply ingrained patriarchal discourse, end of quote. She is best known for her Lupe and Sirena series and Our Lady 1999 and Our Lady 2008 that wreak havoc both in the US and in Europe. The purpose of my paper is to analyze how López takes advantage of the multivalence of the Virgin of Guadalupe as a part of traditional Mexican iconography and reinterprets the traditional archetype from a queer and feminist perspective. The presentation will examine 3 digital images, including the famous or infamous Our Lady 1999, and 2 digital collages from López's Lupe and Sirena series beginning in 1999. In order to show how the artist challenges stereotypical archetypes by rewriting those long prevailing myths and developing new empowering discourses. The presentation will concentrate on the analysis of López's images, with a particular focus on the play of what Victor Burgin calls a pretext, words or worlds beneath or beyond the image. In addition, my goal is to show how these 3 interpretations of traditional myths and archetypes allow for a creation of new personal and collective identities. And time permitting, I may also refer to the controversies and protests that the exhibition of Our Lady raised in 2001 in Santa Fe and then later on in Ireland. Both Our Lady and Lupe and Sirena series make use of the image of the Virgin Mary, who holds an unrivaled place in the history of Christianity in Latin America and who is one of the most important figures of Mexican and Chicana culture. At the same time, the story of La Virgen in Latin America and later on in the US is to a large extent ambiguous, and the ambiguity is reflected by what Dina Gonzalez describes as, quote, competition that exists between the older Virgin of the Conquest, La Conquistadora, and the younger Virgin of Guadalupe, end of quote. La Conquistadora arrived in America under a different name as one of the symbols brought with various Spanish exhibitions that were designed to present and implant a venerable Christian tradition. Catholic tradition, in fact. Her Mexicanization began with the 1531 apparition to Juan Diego, and as Teinon observes, La Virgen de Guadalupe, quote, was already dramatically changed from the image of the same name in Spain, end of quote. She had indigenous features and elements when she appeared to Juan Diego. For example, her hands on the tilma, the original painting, were longer and thus repainted or altered to look shorter, to look more like indigenous people's hands. The scope of the paper does not permit to discuss those differences in detail, but such a particular rendering of La Virgen was to win over the conquered people, providing them with a sacred patron, one of their own, that would protect them and at the same time help convert them to Catholicism. And other circumstances of the apparition confirm to a large extent this theory. For example, the place where she appeared to Juan Diego, according to the story, used to be the place of worship of the indigenous goddess Tanantzin, which happens quite often also here in Poland. Due to the complex history on both sides of the Atlantic, the Virgin can be called a polyvalent figure, as she symbolizes different issues. She is, quote, a figure who embodies the suffering of Chicana, and Mexican populations in the context of colonization, racism, and economic disempowerment, end of quote. At the same time, her image is used, quote, to signify resistance to colonization and economic exploitations as a sign of racial solidarity, for she is imagined to have brown skin, or as a sign of transnational solidarity, for she is a patron saint of Mexico, end of quote. The Church, on the other hand, deploys her image in service of its regressive sexual politics. The image is used by the artist, but she also appears in different contexts of everyday life. As Luis Calvo claims, the Virgin of Guadalupe is omnipresent in Chicano visual space, and you can see some examples here. She is painted on car windows, tattooed on shoulders, emblazoned on neighborhood walls, silkscreen on t-shirts sold at local flea markets. Periodically, she says, quote, her presence is manifested in miraculous apparitions on a tree near Watsonville, California, on a water tank, a car bumper, or a freshly made tortilla, end of quotes. Due to that, the image of the Virgin is a sign that is especially available for semiotic resignification and cultural transformation. Alma López took advantage of this semiotic opportunity, created a series of digital images that break open and transfigure previous interpretations and uses of a Virgin. The original image is placed in a basilica in Mexico City. The Virgin Mary is wearing a long-sleeve gown covering her from neck to toe. She has a blue mantle with gold stars covering her head and the back of her body. She holds her hands in prayer, eyes are cast down. Radiant light marks her as Immaculata, the Virgin Mary, distinct from Madonna with a child, though that is also controversial, and Robert probably could talk a little bit more about that. She is standing on a dark crescent moon, indicating her exceptional grace held up by a little angel. As Nicole Stratton concludes, quote, each aspect of a figurative composition is symbolic of her humility and obedience. Her head is covered, her eyes cast down, and her face turned slightly away from the viewer, end of quotes. In Our Lady, Alma López presents a different version of a Virgin. What strikes the viewer from the first look is that the artist draws attention to the brown female body by exposing more of it. She portrays Latina performance artist Raquel Salinas. The Virgin is clothed in roses only, which were the evidence of her 1531 apparition in Mexico. The starched shawl is folded at the bottom of the frame instead of covering her figure, and the gown is blue-gray instead of the blue one with stars, with the image of the Aztec goddess Coyolxauhqui, the rebellious daughter. The angel holding the crescent of the moon is replaced by a bare-breasted Latina, superimposed over a viceroy butterfly. The stance or pose is completely different from the original. The model has her hands on her hips and she looks defiantly at the spectator. In addition, she is posed more like Michelangelo's David to show movement. She is as if walking out of a picture. In this collage, López is definitely drawing from the previous artistic renderings of La Virgen. For example, Esther Hernández, La Virgen de Guadalupe defendiendo de los derechos de los Chicanos, or Yolanda López's Guadalupe triptych that also refigured the original image of the Virgin, presenting her as a karate fighter, marathon runner, or as seamstress and abuelita, respectively. These portrayals and subsequent portrayals by the same artist, and the one from the other side of the border by a Mexican artist, also raised controversies, and the artists received threats for such rendering of a Virgin. Therefore, the question arises, what makes it special, and what was so controversial about it? How does López cross the borders of tradition with that image? What definitely evokes objections, and let me come back to this image so that you have it in front of your eyes. So what definitely evoked objections is the emancipation of a brown female body. In Our Lady, López connects La Virgin to her body. In López's portrayal, Lupe is a woman, quote, flaunting her sexuality rather than submitting to the biological imperative of her gender, end of quote. In this way, she does away with the virgin-whore dichotomy and also provides Chicanas with an alternative cultural sign of a brown female body to identify with. Moreover, remembering that the meaning is constructed from the way elements are selected and combined, and here I can refer to what Filip Lipinski was talking about, the play of meaning, so, blame him for that afterwards. It is important to recognize the play of Victor Bourguin's pretext in Our Lady. He uses the term pretext on several occasions with reference to the interpretation of visual arts, for example, in The End of Art Theory or in Different Spaces, Place and Memory in Visual Culture. And he defines pretexts as elements that exist in popular preconscious, which even if they don't get chosen, exist and quote, can be called to mind by the majority of individuals in a given society at a particular moment in history, thus revealing both manifest and latent contents of the image, end of quotes. Those elements will obviously yield a different set of images along the paradigmatic chain, as well as make the interpretation depend on one's cultural location. In this case, it's the original portrayal of a virgin that functions as this pretext and influences the reading of López's work. The church version of La Virgen, however again different depending on one's individual knowledge of her story, is evoked in the audiences and informs the audience's reactions to López's work. Those pretexts are combined with what Luz Calvo calls the play of recognition and misrecognition. It's reflected, for example, by a butterfly metaphor. Significantly, in her collage, the artist chooses the viceroy butterfly, La Mariposa, which reappears, by the way, in López's works, that mimics monarch butterfly, and which, unlike viceroy butterfly, is poisonous. As López comments, quote, "The viceroy pretends to be something it is not, just to be able to exist. For me, the viceroy mirrors parallel and intersecting histories of being different or other, even within our own communities. Racist attitudes see us Latinos as criminals and economic burden, and families may see us as perverted or deviant. So from outside and inside our communities, we are perceived as something we're not, when in essence we are very vulnerable viceroy butterflies just trying to live and survive," end of quotes. López also addresses queer sexuality with the fact that Our Lady is upheld by a queer Chicana, Raquel Gutierrez, instead of a little angel, which can be interpreted as the artist's statement that the Virgin is indeed the mother of all, also those who have been excluded from participation in traditional religious rituals, but who in fact have been brought up in a culture that sustained those rituals. She herself allows for such an interpretation while addressing the criticism she encountered. She also, addressing the criticism, says that she doesn't know what wreaked so much havoc, why the image was so controversial, and she says, quote, "I know that there is nothing wrong with this image, which was inspired by the experiences of many Chicanas and their complex relationship to La Virgen de Guadalupe." So Our Lady is, in fact, her exploration of the way her own life fit into the structured meaning of a Virgin of Guadalupe that led her to using Sandoval's term, quote, "meta-ideologize the image and create the powers that claim ownership to the sign," end of quote. And by meta-ideologizing, Sandoval means the operation that appropriates dominant ideological forms and uses them whole in order to transform it. And here it is quite obvious that López does not reproduce the exact image, but she uses the key elements of a sign. Finally, with her representation of La Virgen, she raises a question of ownership, or in other words, who is entitled to the Virgin, who can portray her, or more significantly, who says how the faith will be exercised and how women are supposed to behave within the faith, with reactions to Alma's portrayal implying that only traditional renditions are valid. All in all, with Our Lady, she subverts commonly accepted rules and paradigms and poses a threat to those long-established archetypes because, as Emma Perez argues, considering contemporary Chicano politics, quote, "We are once again threatened by a reemergence of uncompromising nationalist movements in which feminisms are dismissed as bourgeois, in which queer voices are scoffed at as a white thing, and in which anyone who does not sustain the family values of modernist patriarchal nationalism is not tolerated and is often silenced," end of quotes. Such discourse determines reductive reading of La Virgen, and López's image, in turn, allows for a liberating interpretation of the Virgin, taking her away from Chicano nationalists who tried to maintain control over the meaning and opening her up for feminist and queer potential. She continues her revisions of La Virgen with her Lupe and Sirena series, and let me fast forward to that. So I will focus on two more images. The first of her two collages, Encuentro from 1999, and Lupe and Sirena in Love, also from 1999, which both make explicit the queer potential of a Virgin of Guadalupe. In Encuentro, López presents the meeting of La Sirena and La Virgen de Guadalupe. She deploys the elements that reappear in her works, La Virgen, La Sirena, the mermaid, and La Mariposa, the viceroy butterfly, already discussed when talking about Our Lady. Here, though, the viceroy butterfly is part of a broader play of pretexts. First of all, it appears in combination with two other images. La Sirena, the object of La Virgen's love interest, comes from a popular Mexican game, La Loteria, which is similar to bingo, and it makes use of the images referring to Mexican national imaginary, and at the same time very often reproduces gender and racialized gender as well in a conventional fashion. And you have the examples here, what a lady is presented like and what are the male alternatives to that. Calvo also notes that, quote, within the grid of Mexicanidad by Loteria, La Sirena stands out as a hybrid subject. She is part woman, part fish, end of quote. What's more, she appears to be of mestiza heritage because instead of the usual blonde hair, this mermaid has long wavy black hair, and thus she is yet another figural representation of Chicana subjectivity. Assuming again that the meaning of this work of art is constructed through the interdependence of the paradigmatic axis and the syntagmatic axis, the reading of Encuentro will largely depend on the audience's knowledge of the pretext of the three elements. And hence, for general audiences, the scene in Encuentro may resemble Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel. In López's work, though, the Old Testament God is replaced with a mestiza Guadalupe, Adam with a hybrid Sirena. The all-male act of the creation of Adam is thus replaced with an all-female act of the creation of a brown, hybrid, and or queer body. However, since, quote, subaltern practice makes use of a post-colonial preconscious, which is distinct from common knowledge of the society at large, as Calvo says, López's work will be read in a different way by the insiders who get it. The pretext of the three elements, the monarch butterfly, Tonantzin, or other images from La Loteria, with, as Calvo suggests, a chain of linguistic associations. Whoops, I'm sorry for that. A chain of linguistic associations along the paradigmatic axis, so the play with the prefix Mari, as well as the meaning constructed along the syntagmatic axis, two women embracing each other, all suggest queerness illustrated in the birth of a queer desire. Moreover, this combination portrays meeting of two figures representing two very distinctive discursive spheres, namely the sacred and the profane. Not only was the artist pointing out this arbitrariness of this distinction, but she was also showing that, quote, the spiritual need not be relegated to restrictive spaces, end of quotes. She continues to use the post-colonial preconscious in Lupe and Sirena in Love. Here, in turn, the artist goes one step further. I'll go back to. Because she presents La Sirena in an embrace with La Virgen, which refers directly to the queer desire, or what Luz Calvo dubs a Chicana lesbian primal scene, the fantasy of Nuestra Madre, our mother, in a sexual embrace with another woman. Moreover, in this collage, the artist adds more elements, not only creating a certain depth in an image, but also providing a Chicano-specific context. The iconic elements that appear in Encuentro are combined with other images, that of a panorama of Los Angeles, a man running away from La Migra, the corrugated fence constructed on the US-Mexico border with the year 1848 overimposed of the Virgin of La Virgen de Guadalupe, so the year of Guadalupe Hidalgo treaty. And at the bottom of the page, the subtitle, the map of the war between US and Mexico. These spatial references to the US-Mexico borderlands imply the transnational character of Mexican-American identity, also of López identity, and the queer relationship between the hybrid subject, La Sirena, and the Virgin appears in this particular context. whose geography, as Calvo again concludes, quote, is not that of a rational, imperialistic cartographer, but rather the layered space of the unconscious, where past and present, here and there, can exist in one image, end of quote. The cherubs holding roses that constitute the framework of a collage, and that are the proof of the roses are the proof of the apparition of La Virgen to Juan Diego, both bring us to the 16th century, and finally give the entire image a kitschy and humorous touch, reminiscent of Thomas Ibarra-Frausto's identification of frascace aesthetics in Chicano art, which brings us to my final point, the techniques that López uses. Because the subversiveness of her project is reinforced by the technique deployed, namely the digital collage. Professor Kutnik was talking about the definition of collage, so I'll not explain what collage is, and you all know that. Digital collage differs from traditional collage because digital images are endlessly available, and this cut and paste technology allows artists to resize, blend, and create images that appear seamless. López's images, however, are not seamless. They call attention to this cut and paste technique, and it may not be that visible here, but when you look at better reproductions of the images, you see that it's done on purpose. She points to this fact that it's all combined, selected, combined, and put together. The lack of seamlessness and obviousness of cut and paste, in turn, makes it similar to rascachismo, evoked already, and Ibarra-Frausto defines it as a stance rooted in resourcefulness and adaptability, yet ever mindful of aesthetics, whose make-do principle assumes utilization of available resources, which makes for syncretism, juxtaposition, and integration, end of quote. So we may say that López's art is digital rascachismo, or she professes queer camp aesthetic. It is also a potentially empowering medium for creative expression, usually used by male artists. Because of its ability to transform pre-existing imagery using existing images and creating new meanings out of them, it also implies hybridity of identity through the layers that she superimposes one over another. Finally, and this is what Robert was talking about the power of mass media, she becomes a public figure immediately because she posts her work on the internet and can reach wider audiences, thereby having this significant impact on Chicano visual space. To conclude, with her revisioning of La Virgen, Alma López takes her out of the semiotic structure of the Catholic Church and revisits the paradigms that prevent female development, thus encouraging Chicanas to develop their own paradigms of female behavior based on other constructs. She also provides Latinas with a brown female body to identify with. And moreover, through such portrayal of the Virgin, she makes a point about, quote, women interpreting their symbols of veneration for themselves. So in other words, she gives back the Virgin VI to the viewer, and it's the viewer who then must question his or her perspective of a symbol, its spiritual content and the religious relic all at once. Her message is reinforced by more recent portrayals of La Virgen de Guadalupe, Coyol Shauki, as you can see here, and from 2004, and Our Lady of Controversy 2, which is even more malcriada than either, as Alicia Gaspar de Arbo concluded. It's inspired by Delia Montoya and her portrayals of women warriors, the boxers, fighting on the ring. And this way, she deconstructs and decontextualizes the dominant code and reinterprets the message through an alternative context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this revealing paper. And now I'd like to ask Dr. Izabella Kimak to come to the floor. She's assistant professor in the Department of American Literature and Culture at Maria Curie-Sklodowska University in Lublin. Her graduate work on South Asian American literature resulted in several publications, including Bicultural Bodies, a study of South Asian American women's literature, published by Lang in 2014. Her current research project is situated at the intersection of literature and visual art and focuses on representations of visual art in contemporary American fiction. So please welcome Izabella. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And now, I'd like to begin my, my today's presentation by saying that, unlike many of you here, I deal with words, not with images. Although most recently I've become interested in images as mediated through words. So, to be more specific, I'm trying to analyze literary representations of visual arts, and I'm trying to focus on the ends to which those representations are put by novelists mostly. So what I would like to share with you today are a few thoughts concerning the deployment of visual arts, graffiti, and abstract painting, to be more specific, in a semi-autobiographical text by Jonathan Lethem, coming from 2003, which is titled The Fortress of Solitude. Okay, that's my title slide. So mostly I'm going to show you words, not images, excerpts from the novel that I'm going to focus on specifically. But I would like to begin my presentation with this particular quote by Lethem himself. And in an email exchange with a Canadian novelist, Lydia Millett, which was published in Baum magazine, Lethem explains his vision of what a novel is. And he says, as you can see on the screen, that for him, the novel is by its nature impure, omnivorous, inconsistent, and paradoxical. It is most itself when it is doing impossible things, struggling modes, gobbling contradiction. Now, I've chosen this particular quote to begin my presentation with because, in my view, this characterization of a novel applies really well to what Lethem does in The Fortress of Solitude. The novel, in my opinion, does such an impossible thing of straddling two modes of representation, the literary and the visual. And I want to be very specific that the novel does not include any graphic material per se. It is not a graphic text, yet it heavily relies on the realm of the image in its deployment of visual arts, the two examples that I'm going to focus on being graffiti and abstract painting. Now, Lethem, in my view, uses visual art or representations of visual arts to feather his narrative interests, which in Godby's words come down to, and I quote, the complex relationship between gentrification, race, and middle-class white identity, end of quote. Now, I don't want really to summarize the text of Lethem's book. I guess many of you perhaps are probably familiar with it, but for the sake of those of you who are not, I will just say a few words about this major motif that Lethem focuses on, which is the friendship of two kids, the white Dylan Abdus and the black Mingus Root, who grow up together in the 1970s in a part of Brooklyn called Gowanus, just on the verge of becoming gentrified and becoming transformed into this more glamorous Borum Hill. And you can see the area marked here on the map, and some pre-gentrification and post-gentrification pictures of the area. Now, the relationship between these two friends and neighbors is complicated by issues of class and race. In the pre-gentrification Brooklyn, it is actually Dylan's white skin that puts him at a disadvantage. He is constantly bullied and victimized by black kids, despite Mingus's efforts to protect him. And this victimization becomes more serious due to Dylan's mother's idealism and this idealistic wish to educate Dylan together with his underprivileged neighbor in the public school system. Because of his childhood experiences, Dylan grows up to be a person unable to come to terms with his past, and he's constantly struggling with who he actually is. This notwithstanding, it is as early as in their teenage years that it becomes clear to both of them that Dylan's race and class will offer him opportunities denied to Mingus on account of his race and class. And well, this impact of race and class differences, between the two friends is reflected in their respective life trajectories. And just in a nutshell, Dylan's excellent test results in this public high school in Brooklyn, it's intermediate school, actually, not high school, get him a place at Stuyvesant, which is this prestigious high school in Manhattan, from where he goes on to become a Berkeley graduate and a music journalist. While in contrast, Mingus drops out of school, abuses drugs, shoots his grandfather during a domestic dispute, and ends up incarcerated. Now, when The Fortress of Solitude was first published, what the reviewers unanimously stressed was the novel's preoccupation with its urban setting in Gowanus/Borum Hill. And I wanted to discuss a few of those reviews with you, but actually I just realized last night that my presentation was too long, so I'm just going to go through these reviews very quickly. But even if you look at the first sentences, the words Brooklyn, Gowanus, Borum Hill, or neighborhood appear in the very first sentences of those reviews. New York Books here and the New York Times books section. The narrative preoccupation of Lethem with the urban landscape was also emphasized by scholars, and suffice it to say at this point that The Fortress of Solitude has got its share of searing critique from many literary scholars on account of the alleged glorification of gentrification in Lethem's text. I'm not particularly convinced that these critiques are justified, but what I'm going to focus on more specifically is art, not gentrification. But there is, of course, a link between the two. And the first section of the novel, and by saying the first section, I mean literally the first 2 pages. The first section ends with the words, and I quote, "White people were returning to Dean Street, FU," end of quote. And of course, these words are a foreshadowing of what the protagonist, Dylan Abdus, will see in his neighborhood at the end of the novel when he returns to Brooklyn after a several-year-long absence. Now, what is significant about The Fortress of Solitude, in my opinion, is that it places the process of gentrification with all its racial and class implications in the context and against the background of art. Not only visual art, but also music, which plays a significant role in The Fortress of Solitude, but of course that's beyond the scope of this presentation. Now, the association between gentrification and art should perhaps not come as a surprise, as Godby argues. Gentrification derived much of its early cultural capital from an association with artists. And artists turned to inner city areas, neighborhoods, primarily in search of cheap housing, but also they saw this move as a way to distance themselves from this kind of more homogenized, conservative, suburban mentality or mindset. Now, if one adds to that Richard Florida's seminal theorization of a city as a center of creative capital, it seems to me that any text focusing on gentrification needs, by necessity, to evoke the city's artistic milieu. But Lethem's text, in his text, art comes to the foreground to such an extent that I personally would call it a novel of art rather than a novel of gentrification, which is a designation accepted by some scholars. And I will attempt to argue today that art is used by Lethem in a metaphoric way, as a metaphor for personal identity, but also as a parallel to the neighborhood, reflecting the changes that the neighborhood undergoes. Now, throughout the rest of my presentation, there will be 2 parts, actually, to my argument. In the first one, I'm going to focus on graffiti, and the last section of the presentation will be devoted to abstract painting. Now, the 1970s, the decade in which the first part of Lethem's tripartite novel is set in, coincided, of course, with the development of the graffiti art movement in New York City. And I wanted to share with you a quote from the History of American Graffiti, which, let me just tell you that it's, the History of American Graffiti is an excellent source in as much as it is a record of art that is that is gone, that has disappeared, and of course, well, many of the pieces of the graffiti pieces are can no longer be seen within the city space or cityscape due to the the desire of the authorities of New York City in particular to purify the city of graffiti. So this thick book is unparalleled in this respect, and it's the only such source to my knowledge, and it's a very recent book too, coming from 2010, if I'm not mistaken. Now, Little Soul 159 is one of the artists covered in this book, and he makes this idealistic and utopian statement concerning the power of graffiti to solve the problem of racism. And as you can see here, he exclaimed that graffiti tore down the racial barriers of the late 1960s, early 1970s. The world could take a great lesson in conquering racism by giving everyone a can of spray paint. Well, I'm not so sure of that. Now, Lethem's picture is way more complicated than that. And even though his book centers on this friendship between a black boy and a white boy, a friendship which is strengthened by the predilection of the two kids for graffiti writing and for comic books. Lethem does not portray graffiti as a solution to the problem of races, quite the opposite, in fact. His narrative of the two boys dabbling in graffiti actually shows the impenetrability of the racial divide, despite Dylan's especially desire to get rid of the racial divide altogether. Now, but before speaking of the racial implications of graffiti writing in the Fortress of Solitude, I would like to concentrate for a brief moment on the function of graffiti in general as Lethem sees it. And I would like to consider with you a quote, like a lengthy quote from the novel. Now, when Mingus initiates Dylan into the art of graffiti, he takes him to Brooklyn Bridge, of all places, and to have a look at some of the tags placed there. And as we read here, the bridge was an argument, a plea with space. On the vast tower planted at Manhattan's mouth were two lavish word paintings, red and white and green and yellow sprayed fantastically high on the rough stone, edges bled in geological texture. The first read Mono, the second Lee, syllables drained of meaning, like Mingus's own tag, Doze. Dylan understood what Mingus wanted him to see. The painted names had conquered the bridge, pinned it to the secret street, claimed it for Brooklyn. End of quote. Now, tagging their monikers, the young graffiti writers, Mono and Lee, figuratively conquer the space belonging to this more glamorous part of New York City, which is Manhattan. But in light of the oncoming gentrification of Brooklyn, it can also be said that graffiti enables young, disenfranchised men to lay claims to their area, which they are soon to be deprived of by those more affluent new arrivals. As Lethem puts it elsewhere in the novel, and I'm not sure if you can read those texts, but I really wanted to use this particular picture of graffiti work by Is DeWeese, one of New York City's graffiti writers, as a background photo. I blurred it a little bit, but well, okay, anyhow, I'm going to read the sentence to you. A tag was a reply, a call to those who heard, like a dog's bark understood across fences. That's the quote. Now, this comparison of tags to dog's bark, of course, makes one think immediately of tags as markers of a particular area under the control of a particular graffiti group or gang, whatever you wish to call it. Now, David Coughlin makes an interesting comparison of tags to the sound effect panels in comic books. And of course, Lethem's interest in comic books is signaled already in the title of his novel, which of course refers to Superman's hideaway. But now what Coughlin argues is that tags, like word balloons, make visible, non-visible sounds. And he goes on to argue, and I quote from him, "The tags were the means by which the invisible autographed the world, the disenfranchised trying to draw themselves into the panel or to come into frame." To focus now more specifically on the way in which graffiti reflects the dynamics of Mingus's and Dylan's friendship, The two are presented in the book as tagging Mingus's moniker, Doss, all over Brooklyn, all over the neighborhood. And initially, Dylan tries to come up with his own moniker, but after a while, he gives up on that. And again, I'd like to analyze a quote from Liam's text with you. Now, as we read here, the white kid has stopped looking for his own moniker, being encouraged by the black kid to throw up his perfect replication of the black kid's tag instead. It's a happy solution for both, we are told. Why would it be so? Why would it be a happy solution for both? And now, Liam answers that it enabled Mingus ubiquity. It gave him ubiquity, which was the bottom line standard for a graffiti writer's success. But what is more interesting is what Dylan gets out of this, this cooperation. Now, as we read here, he's been allowed to merge his identity in this way with the black kids, to lose his funky music white boy geekdom in the illusion that he and his friend Mingus Rood are both Doss, no more and no less. A team, a united front, a brand name, an idea, end of quote. So in other words, replicating his friend's tag is for Dylan a form of escapism from the burden of his white race in this pre-gentrified, mostly colored Brooklyn. Pretending that he is Doss, that he is in essence a replication of Mingus Rood, Dylan tries to forget about his actual position as an outsider on account of his skin color and on account of the fact that his family are relative newcomers to the area. Now, the graffiti art of the two teenage friends and its metaphoric potential of expressing both Dylan's tenuous position in the neighborhood as well as the tensions inherent in his friendship with Mingus is juxtaposed in the novel with another type of visual art, that produced by Dylan's father, Abraham. Now, having renounced his early representational work, Abraham embarks on a sort of a life project, which is, quote, an abstract painting unfolding in time, in the form of painted frames of film, end of quote. Abraham's project functions in the novel as a sort of a leitmotif running through the whole text. The project lasts years, decades even. Dylan remembers his father working on his film when the two lived in Brooklyn, when Dylan was still a child, and when Dylan is already in his mid-30s, and he meets his father in California for a science fiction convention. The depiction of the convention makes it clear that Abraham's project shows no sign of completion ever. And it's very interesting to note that, as a sort of a digression, that Abraham is a sort of a celebrity figure at this convention, not because of his abstract art by any means, but because of the cover art he produces for science fiction novels. And due to his work as a cover artist, he earns both a living and recognition among those science fiction fans. Now, over the years, naturally, Abraham's project undergoes conceptual evolution. He begins with painting cartoonish figures against a sort of, like a lakeside. Then these give way to more abstract shapes of color, blobs, rectangles of color that hover against a blurred horizon. Yet later, development concerns a gradual removal of color from the frames. And a final thing, another change in the project that Dylan has a chance to see in California concerns or is an addition of a green triangle to the frames. And it is a triangle which is trying to fall sideways, but fails. So there is this back and forth movement from frame to frame. Okay, 5 more minutes, or am I? Okay, thank you, thanks. Now, so I'm going to skip a fragment which deals with the rootedness of Abraham's project in the neighborhood of Brooklyn, and I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about the significance of Abraham's project as he sees it, and then a few concluding remarks. So now, initially, Abraham refuses to play the film, as for him, the stillness of the film, as you can see here, was part of the project. Now, the fragment makes it clear that what Abraham toys with is the concept of time, and he sees his project as a contemplation of the passing of time. He sees his own role as that of an observer of this process. In this way, I would argue, his art could be understood as a parallel to the neighborhood. which is also, if you remember, in the process of transition. Now, change may hardly be noticeable on a day-to-day or a frame-to-frame basis, but is certainly visible when one has a chance to see a longer sequence of the project, as Dylan has a chance to see it in California. And in this way, Dylan's surprise at seeing this triangle all of a sudden added to the frames may be compared to his surprise at visiting Borum Hill at the end of the novel. Not being able to see those daily changes, those minute changes, both in the project and in the area, Dylan is exposed to a sort of a final effect, in inverted commas, which comes as a surprise to him. Now, what is then the relationship between the representation of graffiti art and abstract painting in Lethem's text? At first glance, they may seem to have nothing in common, graffiti being this example of the more lowbrow art, which is the province of those young, underprivileged men who conquer space by tagging their monikers, and it's the only way they can conquer space, actually. Abraham's art, by contrast, is in his own view an example of a more highbrow enterprise, and he himself compares it to, or values it more than his more middlebrow art of producing cover for science fiction novels. Now, on a more complex note, what connects the two types of art is their use of repetition. Now, tags, of course, are repetition par excellence. Their value is understood, after all, in terms of the size and frequency of display. Abraham's art is also based on repetition, but it is a repetition with a twist. As Coughlin argues, Abraham's frames differ from tags because of the fact that they are based on a deliberate sequence, while tags convey nothing but repetition. Now, to conclude, what visual art contributes to Lethem's novel is its metaphoric potential. Both graffiti and abstract painting may function as metaphors for identity and for the neighborhood. If graffiti's repetitive character makes it an apt symbol both of the disenfranchisement of the working class people in the process of urban renewal and of Dylan's merging his identity with that of Mingus through his appropriation of the latter's moniker, then Abraham's art as a series of interrupted frames would be a parallel both to Dylan's discontinuous identity and to the changes that occur within the neighborhood, all three resisting closure. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this paper. And our next presenter will be Dr. Urszula Niewiadomska-Flis, who teaches American literature at the John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin. Her scholarly interests hover around representations of foodways in literature and film, fiction of regional America, especially literature of the American South, American short story and ethnic immigrant literatures of the USA, as well as American TV series. She is the author of Aristocratic Ethos in Ellen Glasgow's and Walker Percy's fiction, and The Southern Mistake, Food, Gender, and Houses in Southern Fiction and Films, published in 2011 and 2012, respectively. She recently edited a volume on Dixie Matters, New Perspective on Southern Femininities and Masculinities, published in 2013. The title of her paper is Eyes in Town, Honey, African-American artist reclaiming black womanhood. The floor is yours.
Too far. Along with the mummy figure, fictional Aunt Jemima has been a prominent symbol of African-American womanhood for more than a century now. Originally, Aunt Jemima began as a character in a minstrel show called The Emigrant. She was a fat, jolly, maternal woman with a red head rag tied in a square knot. According to Diane Roberts, she typifies the mythic Old South of benign slavery, grace and abundance. She rules the kitchen, or she instructs the young ladies in decorum, or she buries the family silver in the orchard so that the Yankees won't steal it, unquote. Considered to be the epitome of Southern hospitality, she became a corporate brand name and the official face of the pancake ready mix produced by Pearl Milling Company in 1888, which eventually was bought in 1926 by the Quaker Oats Company. The woman to serve as the live model was Nancy Green, chilly cooking up flapjacks while telling crowds, "Eyes in town, honey." She impersonated Aunt Jemima until her death in 1823. In 1923, and in 1937, the Aunt Jemima symbol was copyrighted as a trademark by the Quaker Oats Company. Now, despite metamorphosis spanning a century now, her image still connotes, according to Maurice Manning, quote, "the unspoken relationship among black servant women, the kitchen, and good food," unquote. In contradistinction to the trend to present black women as only fit to be domestic workers, like Imitation of Life, Gone with the Wind, or most recently The Help, black artists from the 1960s of the 20th century onwards began to raise and critique issues of power, or lack of it, and otherness through various renditions of Aunt Jemima's image. It's my intention to analyze how African-American artists reclaim the black womanhood taken from them via stereotypical images such as Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben, or Rustus, the smiling cream of wheat chef. The artistic renditions of the image of Aunt Jemima conflate ideological assumptions behind both the Black Power movement and women's liberation movement and their respective artistic corollaries. Both aim to raise consciousness and speak against oppression, be it white or male supremacy. Advocates for black nationalism and feminism, quote, shared a common goal for their imagined allies and kin: social and psychological liberation and freedom from oppression, unquote. In parallel struggles, both art movements aimed to conceive new ways of representing the marginalized self and its relationship with those in power. Collins explains that participants in each of those art movements, quote, placed the same premium on awareness and consciousness as adherents and advocates of the respective larger socio-political movements, unquote. So African-American and feminist artist adherents searched for a new definition of art. They rejected modernist ideal of art for art's sake in favor of art for people's sake. Maulana Karenga expressed this desire to establish the activist function of art. Quote, she said, "Black art must be for the people, by the people, and from the people. This is to say, it must be functional, collective, and committing," unquote. The purpose of art, according to Jeff Donaldson, a painter and a founder of Chicago's Organization of Black American Culture, is to raise a consciousness. In his article, called "The Role We Want for Black Art," Donaldson declared, quote, "Black image makers are creating forms that define, glorify, and direct black people, and art for the people's sake. Those of us who call ourselves artists realize that we can no longer afford the luxury of art for art's sake," unquote. Imbuing creative or artistic production with political agitation, African-American visual artists deconstructed the image of Aunt Jemima. They have been using a subversive image of Jemima to battle with anti-black imagery. The already mentioned Jeff Donaldson, the painter and educator, began working on Aunt Jemima and the Pillsbury Doughboy on August 28, 1963, the day of the Civil Rights March on Washington. He envisioned brutal confrontation rather than peaceful resistance as a means of securing the rights of African Americans. This confrontational stance is visible in the black woman transcending stereotypical docility, submissiveness, and complacency in order to protect herself from a club-wielding police officer. Two fictional characters, Black Jemima and all-white Pillsbury Doughboy, fight either to uphold or to overcome racist oppression. The flag in the background is bent in an angle which is reminiscent of either a swastika, which some critics see as a challenge, quote, to the notions of democracy and freedom associated with the American flag, unquote, or a chevron pattern reminiscent of African textiles, unquote, which, according to other critics, perhaps serves as a metaphor for reordered American state. Joe Overstreet's pop art rendition of Jemima attacks stereotypes with a seemingly gentle touch, albeit with the same latent subversive message. The clash between the woman's beaming face and a machine gun held in her hand captures the dualism between racial iconography of Jemima and her potential, true potential, that is. Jemima's size, she is over 7 feet tall, suggests her self-confidence and empowered consciousness. Tossed into the air, pancakes or clay targets point to an interesting element at the top of the canvas. The ambiguity of the syrup bottle, which could just as well be interpreted as a hand grenade, reveals the inherent irony of this work of art and the image of Jemima as well. So does the sign, which is actually invisible. At the very top, you've got the sign "Made in the USA," which, according to Wallace Sanders, quote, alludes both to the stereotype of Aunt Jemima and to the violent and dangerous reaction to the stereotype that she embodies. Anger clearly lurks within oppressed Jemimas in the pillars Aunt Jemima and Lockhart's No More. A founding father of the black artist movement in Chicago in the 1960s, the pillars transforms Jemima into an energetic black Amazon. This revolutionary woman wields her pancake spatula almost like a lethal weapon against exploitation of African American women. The defiant feast in Lockhart's painting explodes from the box like a hand grenade. The fist, which symbolizes the masked frustration and anger endured on a daily basis, carries the same potential as the pillar's spatula. Lockhart and the pillars refer to and criticize the omnipresence of the commercialized trademark image. A slave in the box, as Jemima was called, is still deposited in cabinets and fridges in the USA. Now, in the seminal piece, The Liberation of Aunt Jemima, Betty Saar explores the stereotype of docile and submissive Jemima through the figure of a gun-toting revolutionary who becomes a symbol of empowerment. I felt myself as a recycler, Saar explained. Thus, Saar reappropriates racial stereotype by transforming Jemima from a passive black domestic into a militant revolutionary with a broom in one hand and a rifle in another. With pride, Saar said, quote, I turned Aunt Jemima into a warrior. She further explains that she started doing assemblage pieces using derogatory images because, quote, it became important for me to use an Aunt Jemima figure and turn her around to be a hero, a heroine, because I felt that that was the only way that African Americans survived, unquote. Now, this assemblage consists of 3 different renditions of Jemima. The background, as a wallpaper, is covered with Aunt Jemima advertisements. In this pop art screen, Jemima, taken directly from the pancake box, is objectified as a commodity, while the foreground consists of a fully bodied Aunt Jemima notepad holder, with the actual painting of a mummy figure with a white baby as the 3rd rendition. The grotesque features of the middle Jemima, I mean the bulging eyes, protruding red lips, and apparent obesity, serve 2 functions. First of all, they allude to shameless minstrelsy, which appropriated black people, but also they point to the use of caricature, and this caricature refers us to the exaggeration typically employed and exploited in racial stereotyping. The 3rd rendition, framed between a broom and a rifle, seems at first sight to be a typical image of a mammy. However, careful examination reveals that her forced smile is a sign of passive resistance. She doesn't care about the crying white child, and her black dress turns out to be a large black clenched fist, symbolizing the radical measures taken by African Americans within Black Power movement. Michael Ray Charles, he is an artist, satirist, and social critic. He works on canvas and paper to create carefully crafted ironic scenes. In Black Cultural Traffic, Lamon comments that Charles's illustrations, quote, register sedimented attitudes of disgust and humor written serially on bodies, unquote. As such, a black body of Aunt Jemima becomes a palimpsest of racist appropriation of black womanhood. In contradistinction to the earlier Jemima renditions, Charles's work trades angry and rebellious images for racially charged depictions which defamiliarize our perception of race and gender. His art seems to investigate and reclaim the caricatures from minstrel shows and degrading stereotypes via defamiliarization and inversion. Stereotypes have evolved, says Charles. I'm trying to deal with present and past stereotypes in the context of today's society. That's what he said. The truth, thus through defamiliarizing Jemima, he asks the viewer to, quote, re-envision Aunt Jemima in dualities that have never existed before, unquote. His art elicits strong reactions from critics, African-American viewers. Some do not understand his intertextual allusions or do not see irony in discomforting visual images. Others accuse him of being a sellout because he, quote, trades on negative stereotypes and blacks, unquote. Michael Ray Charles explains, I mean, he retorts to that, responds to those accusations that you have to address old stereotypes and upend them to superimpose them on contemporary consciousness in order to truly understand them and so that you can exercise them. Now, Jemima wearing a Wonder Woman costume refers to and rejects vulnerability and passivity of a typical Aunt Jemima image. Jemima celebrates her femininity in a Marilyn Monroe-like pose from the Seven-Year Itch with a floppy, she's black and white, but you've got floppy pink slippers on her feet and a red and white polka dot bandana tied on her head and her skirt whooshed up by the wind from a subway gate. Great. Now, another imposition of Jemima on Grant Wood's 1928 painting, American Gothic, seems to endow Jemima with agency as a black woman, as well as grants her access to American dream that was alluded to via the original couple's farm and pitchfork. And in this case, we've got Jemima who holds the broom. Another imagery that Charles reworks in his art is Norman Rockwell's Saturday Evening Post imagery. Using the signature backdrop of Rockwell's yellowed and faded Saturday Evening Post covers, Charles paints a spoof of Rosie the Riveter, where Jemima sits regally and commands respect through her sheer size. The final image shows Jemima as a presidential candidate. Her middle-class image refers to a metamorphosis of the trademark, which is recorded in the attempts of the Quaker Oats Company to minimize the suggestion of racial inferiority in the images of Aunt Jemima spanning a century. Racial inferiority, if not blatant racism. And the company made that to gain acceptance in today's competitive market because it's easy to sell products that refer to middle-class aesthetics than to referring to Old South ideology. Now, Faith Ringgold's quilts about Aunt Jemima reflect her heritage and concern about the image of African-American women. Historic quilts, the narrative paintings bordered with quilted fabric, are media which connect her closely to her familial origin, to her mother. Showalter saw the quilt as, quote, the central figure for female literary creativity, unquote. Quilting was one of the few outlets of creativity available to black women. So likewise, Linda Wagner-Martin argued that quilting is central to the construction of female black identity. Now, in the quilted narratives, Ringgold has the opportunity to tell her own stories using forms that have long been associated with the female craft, the themes and characters from her own life, as well as from African American folk tales. In Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima, Ringgold inverts Jemima's story, in which the heroine becomes an active participant of her life. She is a woman restaurateur in painting, text, and patchwork. Ringgold's use of Jemima's submersion in domesticity and within culinary discourse fits well into what bell hooks argued about African American artists in general. She said, quote, "Artists actively have appropriated and exploited their own negative stereotypes in order to assert control over them," unquote. So this is the center section from, and you can see this story quote in the middle. You can actually come close and read the passages. Okay. Renee Cox, a photographer, mixed media artist, is considered to be one of the most controversial African-American artists working today. What distinguishes her art is not only color and kitsch sensibility, but notorious subversions of racism and sexism. And they are, for example, visible in Yo Mama's Last Supper, a remake of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, where Cox is portrayed as nude Jesus in the middle. In the centerpiece of an exhibition, a large format color photograph entitled The Liberation of Lady J and UB, Cox appears herself as a superhero Raja. This black version of Wonder Woman rescues Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben from their respective commercial packaging. In contradistinction to the packaging, which only shows their fragmented bodies, they always have smiling faces. In the foreground of the packaging, Jemima and Uncle Ben have full-size, muscular and healthy bodies. Such a juxtaposition underscores the hero and heroine's readiness and consciousness, which precipitates their liberation from servility and complacency. Now, in his imaginary comic book series called Gala Sci-Fi Mysteries, W. Jabari Anderson created powerful superheroes out of racist stereotypical characters. The most prominent of the group is Dinah, or Mame, described as, quote, "a ferocious headphone-wearing riff-off on Aunt Jemima, or mommy stereotype," unquote. A Saturnian alien power modifies the molecular structure of her broom, the attribute of her servitude, to transform it into, quote, "a powered instrument to fit Dinah's essence signature," unquote, in her fight with the injustice of the world. The instrument brings out already existing great strength and endurance. We learn, quote, "more than anything else, Mame has an undying will that has served her even more so than her cosmic capabilities. She has a broom that has secrets yet to be unlocked. The broom can project synthetic kinetic energy blasts. She can build up the force by slamming her broom against a hard object. So far, she hasn't reached a limit to the amount of kinetic energy that has been discharged," unquote. So we obviously see the potential. Now, what I was hoping to express in this presentation is that the renditions of Aunt Jemima echo Larry Neal's claim that, quote, "the function of art is to liberate men," unquote. All analyzed works of art address social concerns of African American. They reclaimed the stereotype and deployed it as a weapon. Aunt Jemima is transformed from a happy servant, a passive domestic, cook, a caregiver, to a proud militant who controls her fate and demands respect within society. She has successfully liberated herself from both white oppression and traditional gender roles. Now, majority of those works of art analyzed here depict Jemima, quote, "as a benign matron turned urban gorilla," unquote. Now, Renee Cox and W. Jabari Anderson even endow her with superhuman powers. Jemima is reimagined from a slave in the box into a superhero. Although it's difficult to disagree with Farrington's claim that, quote, "although empowering, the superwoman is not necessarily more realistic than the mummy," unquote. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our last presenter in this session is MALGORZATA Olsza, who is a PhD student in the Department of American Literature at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, where she received an MA in Art History in 2010 and an MA in English in 2013. Her research interests include ekphrasis, graphic novels, contemporary American art, modernist American literature, and American Gothic. She's currently working on a PhD dissertation devoted to the discourse of the graphic novel and the relationship between word and image in contemporary American graphic novels. In 2013, she received the Polish Association for American Studies Annual Award for the Best American Studies MA thesis written at a Polish university. Please welcome MALGORZATA.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Contemporary American graphic novels and comics have long matured beyond the carefreeness of funny stories or superheroes of unquestionable moral authority. Indeed, graphic novelists, writers and illustrators in one person, perceive their work as not only reproduction, but also critical examination of the world. The growing genre of graphic biographies, autobiographies, memoirs, and journalistic accounts is a testament to this trend, demonstrating how issues such as violence, sexuality, or trauma can be confronted. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Can be confronted and exercised in a combination of writing and drawing. The figure of the author became crucial in non-fiction graphic novels with the publication of Mouse. Although the work is universally acknowledged as a Holocaust memoir, Mouse is best described as Jane Evert observes, quote, a highly mediated autobiography, unquote, of Art Spiegelman, the author. A frame tale around the Holocaust story shows Art in the process of writing Mouse, talking to his father and collecting materials. One of the panels presents the reader with a curious self-portrait of Spiegelman as a Mouse cartoonist working at his drawing board. As you can see, Mouse became an overwhelming experience, bordering on the traumatic. And the portrait of the artist emerged as a field of problematical relations with numerous other non-fiction graphic novels following in Mouse's footsteps. This paper will critically examine different instances of authorial self-representation in graphic non-fiction and the role it plays in respective works. I will focus on 3 graphic novels and 3 portraits of the artist, so to speak. Depicted in Fun Home, a family tragicomic by Alison Bechtel, published in 2006. Stitches, a graphic memoir, published in 2009 and written and drawn by David Small. And Palestine by Joe Sacco, published in 2001. Although all of the above works are based on real events, the relationship between the artist as the author, the narrator, and the character is by no means straightforward. The artist is caught up in a web of conflicting forces in which distancing oneself from one's experiences and their simultaneous authentication coexist. As Joseph Wittek observes, quote, any writer, even or especially an autobiographer, creates a fictional persona when he or she begins to write. In autobiographical comics, where the writer imagines not simply a verbal I, but a physical figure of his own character, the relation between writer and narrator becomes even more complex. The ineluctable fictionality of any narrative, even the most thoroughly objective history or autobiography, allows a shifting identification between author and character, unquote. The graphic selves of Bechtel, Small, and Sacco play with the notions of authorial power and character submission. The naive self depicted in a graphic autobiography is often contrasted with the older, more sophisticated self writing the memoir or drawing the memoir. This distance often lies at the heart of the story told. Another important aspect is the relationship between images and words. The contemporary reader may be familiar with the many forms of the speaking eye, including, for example, the eyes of Edgar Allan Poe or Philip Roth, where words take center stage. The contemporary art lover, on the other hand, is sure to know the self-portraits of Rembrandt or Frida Kahlo, but the graphic novel is a format that goes beyond just the verbal and the visual, bringing with itself a set of specific tools. One may construct the character on the basis of both their thoughts and words, as well as appearance. Indeed, as Jan Baetens observes, quote, even in the case of autobiographic graphic telling, the narrator tends to display not just his or her thoughts, but his or her bodily appearance, a considerable difference from the autobiographical mode in verbal storytelling, where the person who says I can keep out of sight throughout the entire story, unquote. Thus, the graphic self emerges as a result of a twofold interplay between the drawn self and the drawing self, and between words and images, respectively. Published in 2006, Alison Bechdel's Fan Home, in a sense, reproduces the compositional model first introduced by Art Spiegelman in Maus. The story focuses on the relation between father and daughter, and it is through this troubled relationship and exercising family demons that Bechdel discovers her true self, a lesbian daughter of a gay father. The memoir is divided into 7 chapters that are beautifully drawn in black, gray, and blue, weaving together interconnected life stories of a father and a daughter. And by creating Fan Home, Bechdel reflects on the process of autobiographical storytelling and problematizes the difference between a traditional autobiography and a cartoon one. By engaging with drawing and a range of visual forms, she emphasizes the graphic representation. She emphasizes that the graphic representation is a multimodal and hybrid form. The author also incorporates intertextual tools. A great number of modernist and literary references appear in Fan Home alongside quotations from contemporary popular culture, mainly TV shows or other cartoons. All of these references, both visual and textual, function as distancing tools, making it possible for Bechdel to recount her story. The author titles each of the 7 chapters with a citation from another text. For example, the first chapter is entitled "Old Father, Old Artificer," and it's a quote from James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Quote, "Old father, old artificer, stand me now and ever in good stead," unquote. These are Stephen Dedalus' closing words in the novel, and invocation to his father and his namesake of Greek legend, Dedalus, to make him a master artist. This textual reference is further developed by the opening panel, which you can see on the right, in which Bechdel transforms the child's game of airplane into an allusion to the Greek myth. Excuse me. Quote, "Considering the fate of Icarus after he flouted his father's advice and flew so close to the sun his wings melted, perhaps some dark humor is intended," unquote. Alison, the narrator, tells us, commenting that, quote, "In our particular reenactment of this mythic relationship, it was not me, but my father, who was to plummet from the sky," unquote. Indeed, Bruce Bechdel died tragically, or as his daughter suspects, committed suicide when Alison was in college. In Fan Home, Alison's father is both Dedalus, an inventor and a brilliant artist, whose greatest passion was reading and renovating Bechdel's family house, but also Icarus, a tragic figure who was not able to fit in this context with small-town mentality. Alison herself, in turn, sets out to become Daedalus, an artist self-consciously evoking Joyce as her artistic mentor. The last chapter is entitled The Anti-Hero's Journey, and it also references Joyce, thus providing a sense of closure. Ulysses is one of the books Alison reads for her English course in college, and the book actually serves as an intellectual connection between father and daughter. Bechdel incorporates the novel into a new understanding of her father, even though she actually admits that she doesn't really understand Ulysses, that she read it, but she cannot really analyze it. And Alison pairs fragments of Joyce's text with drawings representing her own experiences. On page 226, she draws an analogy between her father's death and the suicide of Leopold Bloom's father. Quote, "He'd taken an overdose of something." The caption over a panel depicting Alison standing over her father's grave reads, "But at least he'd left a letter for my son Leopold," unquote. Bruce Bechdel did not leave a letter for his daughter. All Alison is left with are the books she and her father shared, which in the end help her reconstruct the figure of her father and ultimately discover her true self. Indeed, Bechdel describes her own coming out as a lesbian as a process of reading. So on the one hand, the literary allusions provide the reader with an insight into Alison and her father, but on the other hand, they are a testament to the impossibility of ever acquiring the actual truth of what really happened to Bruce Bechdel, to what really happened to the father. Alison, the narrator, confesses in chapter 3 that, quote, "I employ these allusions not only as descriptive devices, but because my parents are most real to me in fictional terms," unquote. Indeed, in her analysis of literary references used in Van Home, Yael Schlick observes that, quote, "Bechdel's projection of the self invariably takes place on the screen of anterior literary archetypes, blending the fictional and the factual, literary and lived experience throughout Van Home," unquote. The memoir, however, also goes beyond the self-analysis of Alison. By citing Joyce, Camus, Proust, Colette, and Fitzgerald, Bechdel clearly states that she belongs to this literary tradition, that she's an artist. David Small, I'm now moving on to the second graphic novel, in his memoir entitled Stitches, also focuses on his own development as an artist. Unlike Bechdel, however, he considers drawing and not really literature to be a decisive factor in his personal and artistic growth. Published in 2009, Stitches tells the story of Small's unhappy childhood in the 1950s Detroit, his relations with a dominant and tyrannical mother, and a seemingly successful father. But most importantly, the work records the trauma of dealing with cancer and the voice loss, followed by a slow and painful recovery, all of which ultimately shaped David into a person and an artist he is today. Small constructs his graphic self in a twofold manner, which I would call, for the lack of better distinction, explicit and implicit. So the explicit strategy involves all instances of presenting the reader with panels depicting David drawing. Indeed, the first time the reader sees young David in his home, he's shown lying on the floor drawing. In fact, David's lifelong companion is drawing, right? Drawing is his only friend, so to speak. One of the panels, the one on the right, actually depicts David interacting with his drawings, which come alive and leave the page. Another sequence shows him jumping into a page. David falls through the esophagus into the stomach, where his cartoon friends await him. The final panel in which David is shown drawing is a confirmation of his artistic success, which also means personal success. David has left his toxic home and found fulfillment in art. Quote, "Art became my home. Not only did it give it back my voice, but art has given me everything I have wanted or needed since," unquote. From a talented, though neglected child drawing alone on the floor of his house, to a recognized artist surrounded by admirers, female admirers, I should add. Small does not really problematize the process of drawing here, but rather simply demonstrates that drawing played an important role in his life. Indeed, the explicit strategy clearly emphasizes the author's status as an artist, but also paradoxically strips this representation of its critical potential. The implicit strategy, on the other hand, is a testament to the author's active role in shaping the story, marking a distance to the events portrayed and constituting a critical analysis of David's life. Here it is the formal side of drawing that matters: style, line, perspective, framing, and building a visual sequence. One visual phenomenon introduced by Small is of special interest to me, namely frequent abstract interventions in the figurative narrative. Most of the abstract sequences are connected with Small's cancer operation and subsequent voice loss, because he was actually diagnosed with a tumor on his neck. He underwent an operation, and when he woke up from the cancer operation, it turned out that he couldn't speak anymore. And his experiences show that his body and his psyche were violated. And the reader encounters the first abstract panels when David lies in a hospital bed on the night before his first operation. A nurse comes into his room to give him an injection with, quote, "just a little something to help him sleep," unquote. David slowly drifts away into deep sleep. But instead of depicting an immediate transition to an operating theater or a figurative sequence showing his dreams, for example, the narrative slows down, switches to another mode, and presents falling asleep by means of 5 abstract panels. The first one depicts white dots and dashes on a black background, and the following 4 are refined versions of the first. Only one white circle is presented as it gradually moves into the bottom left corner, and finally it disappears completely so that the 5th panel is a black square. When taken out of context, the sequence is certain to confuse the reader. He can sense a certain continuation of abstract forms, but the exact meaning of these 5 panels are supposed to convey remains a mystery. Also, when one considers the fact that the visual narrative up to this point in the story has relied on figuration only, the sequence comes across as a disruption, both semantic and semiotic. After the initial moment of confusion, however, the reader is sure to interpret abstract shapes in the context of the previous panels. The white dots and dashes become lamplit streets and buildings David can see from a window lying in bed. Drugged, he focuses on a single shape, a street lamp, and slowly falls asleep. The perspective is changed. Instead of watching David, the reader assumes his point of view. I would argue that this fragment constitutes the first attempt at representing an important aspect of the entire story: states and emotions beyond the control of will, an experience of helplessness, being a subject and not an object. Abstraction in Stitches predominantly appears in connection with vulnerability. A sequence combining figuration and abstraction found on pages 180 and 81 serves as another example. This sequence also disrupts the course of the figurative graphic narrative. The reader is transposed from an operating theater during David's second cancer operation to an unidentified black space. And the sequence starts with a panel depicting a white silhouette falling into a black tunnel. Next, one can see a black panel, a black square with lighter gray edges, 5 panels depicting David's face, with a particular focus on his mouth, and finally the drawing of David lying on an operating table after the operation, surrounded by a field of black and unable to speak. The reading of this sequence is more difficult than the first one. The reader does not simply see what David sees or falls asleep with him, but is drawn into a vortex of blackness. In his struggle to make sense of figuration and abstraction, the reader is simultaneously inside and outside of David. The play of abstraction and figuration here might be seen as questioning the construction of the self. Do I exist without a voice? Further on in the memoir, Small clearly states that, quote, the fact that you now have no voice will define you from here on, unquote. You are like, and that, quote, when you have no voice, you don't exist. You are like an abstract panel in a figurative sequence. But fortunately, as has been seen in previous panels, art gave Small his voice, right? So art and being an artist allowed him to become a full person again. The final, okay, thank you. The final nonfiction graphic novel I want to discuss differs from the other two, in as much as it is not a memoir or a family story, but an example of graphic journalism. Joe Sacco's Palestine depicts the author's experiences on the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip in December of 1991 and January 1992. During his visit, Sacco interviewed hundreds of Palestinians in the occupied territories. A trained journalist, Sacco studied journalism at the University of Oregon. The author placed great emphasis on realistic drawing, accuracy of facts, numbers, and dates, but at the same time did not hesitate to break the first rule of journalism, that is, be objective. Sacco is clearly sympathetic to Palestinian people, and he depicts them as threatened by constant curfew, roadblocks, questioning, and frequent arrests. Images and descriptions of suffering Palestinians, complemented with sequences explaining historical background, constitute the core of Palestine. However, this basic level of telling other people's story is further widened to include yet another dimension, that of Sacco himself. Indeed, the author is present in his account not only as the narrative voice, but also as a character. Palestine thus is suspended between journalistic conventions of reportorial distance and personal character of an autobiographical story. This generic tension is also expressed through drawing. Palestine is for the most part drawn in a very realistic style with the use of only black and white. Panels are mainly rectangular and pages are designed in easy-to-follow grids. The only character that stands out is Joe Sacco himself. And for example, in the first panel, Joe Sacco is this guy with big lips and blank glasses. And the author actually comments that, quote, when I started Palestine, it was a bit rubbery and cartoony at the beginning, because that's the only way I knew how to draw. It became clear to me that I had to push it toward a more representational way of drawing. I tried to draw people more realistically, but the figure I neglected to update was myself, unquote. This cartoony self does not, however, negate or diminish the dramatic character of the entire account. On the contrary, it problematizes the story. By including himself as a cartoon character, Sacco emphasizes and accounts for the shaping power of his own vision upon the narrative he writes, rather than asking the reader to accept his version. And we should remember that the realistic style he employs actually would prone the reader to actually think that this is really what happened, this is like a document. The author constructs a narrative that encourages interpretation and reflection. And to conclude, the use of drawing is a significant innovation in contemporary nonfiction. It licenses or authorizes memoirs for artists whose talent is primarily visual, but also allows writers to expand their stories by the means of drawing. And as Thomas Kauser points out, quote, another set of lives becomes available for self-representation, unquote. These graphic selves are, for the most part, mediated versions of the actual self. They combine the authenticity of the experience with the distance of representation. And it is through this double vision that the reader is presented with a portrait of the artist that is suspended between truth and creation and word and image. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for all the exciting, fascinating papers. I take it we have about 15-minute delay, so it means that we have roughly 10 minutes to ask questions and offer comments, so the floor is open for those.
Jerzy Kutnik, Maria Curie-Sklodowska University. A question for the first speaker, for Eva. How come our own Black Madonna, our own Lady of Częstochowa, is hardly ever present in murals, street art, public art, graffiti? How come she's hardly ever presented as a seamstress, as a boxer, as a fashion model? How come she's hardly ever present in a queer context? I'm asking because Mexican and Polish Catholicism are often compared and are said to be similar. And while I still have the mic, a question for Isa. And well, it's obvious that the presence of visual arts in the novel is, well, it's very strong and very significant and very important. We have abstract expressionism, which is basically white, and we have graffiti, which is basically, especially early graffiti, which is mostly black. But we also have references to music. We have Dylan, and that's a white musician's name, and we have Mingus, which is a famous black musician's name. If you change your angle, would you be able to find as many significant references to music, or it's mostly visual arts? Thank you.
Shall I? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for a question. I actually, I'm not sure if I can answer it, but I think that in the case of Polish Catholicism, even though it's often compared to Latin American Catholicism, we often disregard the history of the church as the institution and the power of the church throughout the 50s until 1989 and the changing role of the church in Poland, the Catholic Church, I mean, in Poland after the transformation. And even though the power seems to be a little bit less visible, it's still visible. So I think, well, the basic answer would be we don't have artists who have guts to do this. Yes, guts, courage, bravery, you know, but on the other hand, I also think that especially like, for example, in the case of Alma López, she has to get out of the closet, not only once, but at least 3 times. And in her case, it's also, I think, the space where she is creating. She is born in Mexico, but she moves to Los Angeles, which is a much more open space for renditions like that, which is not necessarily true about, you know, the situation here in Poland. That's one thing. Another thing is she can also distance herself a little bit. Whereas when you're an artist in a specific country, the politics and policies often, do not make it able for you to distance yourself from the whole context. That's probably, the explanation. I don't know if it answers your question,
Okay, may I? Thank you for the question, and it's an excellent question. And what is frustrating about 20-minute presentation is that one can never really address all the aspects one would like to address, and especially while talking about such a complex text as Lethem's novel. Now, I would like to add one more comment concerning this visual art before I move on to talk very briefly about music. Now. You were saying that there is this contrast between black and white when one compares graffiti and an abstract painting, an abstract art of Abraham Abdus. There is also the colors that Abraham uses later on in his project are also grayish colors. So there is this white, black, and gray, which may also be viewed as like a metaphoric choice of colors to show this the complicated relationships between the races. When it comes to music, of course, music plays such a significant role in this. In the representation of those racial conflicts and tensions, that it would merit at least another paper, another presentation. Now, what I would like to say at this point, of course, there are references. Even Dylan's name is a reference to a white musician, as you've pointed out. But actually, it seems to me that Dylan's fascination with black music is just one example, and that's what also other scholars talking about the Fortress of Solitude stress, is that his fascination with black music is also in a way problematic. It is one aspect in which he adopts this mock black identity in the book. For example, there is a wonderful depiction of a party when Dylan is at Camden College, if I'm not mistaken, one of those mostly, actually 100% white student population college. And those white privileged kids are dancing to black music. And Dylan says, well, for them, it's just a piece of funky music, and they don't really see the racial implications of that. So he was distancing himself from his white friends, claiming that he had this kind of insight into the black culture, but which is also obviously very problematic on account of his status as a white man in Brooklyn. And later on, throughout his life, as a music journalist, Dylan also, he specializes and focuses mostly on black musicians. He collects black music, black paraphernalia, black girlfriends too. So of course there is this whole aspect of like his fascination with blackness, which deserves more thought and more attention, obviously. Thank you.
Next question, please. Danielle, right?
Yeah, this is for MALGORZATA. I really enjoyed your talk. It's an interesting, studying the graphic novel is really a way to bridge literature and art, especially if you look at the American scene. And I'm really interested in this intersection and in this kind of crossroad. And starting from the writers and artists that you worked on, I would like to know if you have also meditated or reflected upon the relationship between these three cartoonists and Robert Crumb, and what he's really doing in terms of reformulating this whole literary imagination. And in particular, in this late, part of his own production, he has really turned into graphic novels, La Nausée by Sartre or Kafka, that is, and then even he also resurfaced Boswell, and turned it into pictures. And so, I would like to know more about this, and also in terms of informal terms. I see a lot of Crumb also stylistically into Sacco, and this is actually one of his favorite young cartoonists. He supports a lot, Sacco as a, in this new journalism. And so I just wanted to ask you about, this kind of new generation as also an extension of this very bold, work that Robert Crumb started, and also.
Thank you for the question, and I will start with Joe Sacco, I think, because Joe Sacco openly admits that Robert Crumb was a big influence on his work, that he read Robert Crumb as a teenager and as a child, and he actually openly says that when he started, so his style, this rubbery, cartoony, kind of exaggerated, grotesque style, that was all Robert Crumb, that he actually admits that. And he actually had to work his way toward his own more independent, more realistic style because of the subject matter he was dealing with. And as far as David Small is concerned, he actually is, so to speak, the odd one out because he doesn't really mention any graphic artists, like graphic novelists or cartoon artists, as his influences or as the things he read as a child, because he works as an illustrator, like mainly for children's books, and he mentions so traditional art, so to speak, as his influence, or movies, black and white movies especially. He doesn't really refer neither to Spiegelman or to Robert Crumb. And Alison Bechtel, right, I know she read Crumb, definitely, but she mostly admitted that Art Spiegelman and his conception of Maus, this kind of father and son story, was what influenced her, although not visually, but only as far as the concept is concerned.
Well, thank you very much. I'm terribly sorry I missed the first paper. But in relation to what you said about the way the Madonna could be used in a Polish context, what I feel just as a person and, by teaching these things is that, identity politics is a very context-bound thing, and I think that the reason why maybe we don't have that type of art in the continent, it's because it's not sponsored by universities, in the US, and a good thing too, but I think that after the 70s, the identity kind of art, it's something that's being produced and funded by institutions. And I feel that, when I read Van Home, it's been offered to me by a friend, after my dad passed away. And, the gay cause doesn't concern me personally, but I was, touched by the way she treats the rest. So all I'm saying is that there is a type of art, and, that sounds kind of elitist, that, can transcend its context. And there are expressions which are valid, interesting, important, but, nonetheless are quite, context-bound. So, in Greece nowadays, there emerges, an art by the sons of Albanian immigrants, but it's not sort of hyphenated in the sense that, American identity art is, which is, to me, a very sort of, particular, politically, culturally, historically, US reality. I don't know, how do you respond to that?
Okay, yeah.
And just one more thing in relation to the Fortress of Solitude. Just, are you interested in the work of Percival Everett, who, I'm not Sidney Poitier, who is quite, who's somebody who's quite ambivalent about the hyphenation in African American literature.
Okay, so Eva.
Yeah.
So maybe just, a brief answer. What you say may be true, but I don't think it's true in the case of Alma López. She was not definitely sponsored by any institution. She had a lot of problems after, producing or creating the image. And in fact, when I was exhibiting Our Lady of 1999 in 2001 in Santa Fe, Museum of International Folk Art in Santa Fe, there were processions and pilgrimages staged in front of a museum. There's a whole book about that. There's a whole recording of people, you know, protesting in front of a museum. She got a lot of hate mail. She's still getting mails. And in fact, when the exhibition was moved to Ireland a couple of years afterwards, they were literally, both her and her partner, Alicia Gaspar de Alba, they were literally threatened because it turned out that Ireland still had, you know, blasphemy laws. So they were afraid that when they, you know, cross the border, when they, you know, land at the airport, they may actually be arrested for the blasphemy. It evoked a lot of controversies, it evoked a lot of protests, and well, it may have, in a sense, gave her some popularity, but I don't think it would actually bring her any sponsors, in inverted commas, you know.
And Isa, how about your response?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understood your question.
It's just there's a writer that who writes because you have Dylan and Michael suggested. So personal average, happens with a lot of people.
Excuse me, could you use the microphone because it's very hard to hear?
It's just because of Dylan and Mingus. There is this writer who, in fact, you know, playfully and also critically, you know, always says, you know, I don't want to be listed in like African American literature section, in the sense that, you know, as long as there's no white, you know, American or, you know, white Polish section. So he has this book, which is a novel, you know, I'm Not Sidney Poitier, which it sort of touches on that, the hyphenation, essentially. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for this reference. I would definitely check it. I'm not familiar with the work you are referring to, so thank you. Yeah, I've just not put it down, the title.
Some final comments on questions before we take our coffee option. Erika?
I want to thank Urszula for her paper and just point out that Michael Ray Charles makes the images that he makes because he believes that those stereotypes remain persistent in American culture. So the complaints that he gets, and often from other African American artists, are that he's replicating those images, but he really believes that until the stereotype of Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben disappears, which doesn't appear to be real likely anytime soon, he's going to continue to make those images, among others. So, you know, it's worth considering the sort of salience of that stereotype.
Thank you. One more.
Urszula, I also have a question. Do you know the work of Robert Colescott? And if you do, well, I want to show it to you because it's...
Okay, I'll write it down and we'll check to expand things.
Yes, Mimi.
Speaking of Robert, Robert Wilson famously used mammies in his Deaf Man Clance 1971 production. He used the image in other productions as well, but he had something like 20 mammies who were all identical, slowly crossing the stage in this undulating sway, unison. Very, very slowly they came out, and first you saw one and you thought that was quite a strong image, recognizing it right away, and then it multiplied, and there must have been 20 mammies, all identical, swaying across the stage. And suddenly in the middle, there was a giant pink bunny, did a very fast dance. For your research, which is excellent.
Thank you. I'll write those
mammies.
down. Thank you so much. Okay. Any other questions or comments? If not, I think it's time for a coffee break.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that during the break we will have to rearrange the stage because we want to organize the roundtable discussion around several little round tables that we will set on the stage. We cannot get everybody onto the stage, but we will have two cameras showing two sides of the semicircle that we create, and then we will want to invite some of you to sit on this side, the others on that side, and then
just one more sentence. I think a round of applause for our presenters is in order.